So Dan, here we are together again.
Yes, indeed.
Who would have thought? It hasn't even been a year since I was fortunate enough to meet you, and imagine my surprise when this name I had found on the internet, the Collaboratory, that I was going to have the opportunity to meet and partner with someone that developed the first Collaboratory.
Well, a team did it, but I had something to do with it, right?
Yeah, so you can imagine my surprise, right? Like, wow, I just thought it was an interesting concept. I found it on the internet. I loved the name. But the more I've gotten to know you and really learn about the early ideas that formed a Collaboratory, the more engaged I became and the more I was certain that we were heading in the right direction. So I would just love to hear you kind of describe those early days. Was there something specific about the name that you chose, and what were the first kind of designs around the original Collaboratory?
Well, let me start just slightly earlier than when the name was created. So as the computers evolved, and then as communication evolved, and they came together to give us what we now know as the internet and then later the World Wide Web, groups of people, including at the University of Michigan, began thinking that this marriage of computing and communication was going to have something to do with how people did intellectual work together. Mm-hmm. And in particular, the National Science Foundation, which is the prime funder of basic research in this country, was interested in how the network could facilitate creative research activity. They began with a project called the Express Project that we and Carnegie Mellon did together to explore how technology could be used to produce proposals and then to actually process the reviewing of these proposals in the peer-based way that NSF had done. And that project really then started leading into collaborative writing over the internet.
Okay.
And then the director of the part of NSF that funds computer science at that time was a man named Bill Wolf, who was a very visionary professor based at Carnegie Mellon. And our work with him and NSF led to the idea of creating a workshop to think more broadly about the impact of the internet on the conduct of scientific research. Mm-hmm. And they got Josh Lederberg, who was a Nobel laureate, who was head of Rockefeller University, to host that, and invited about 30 people to come together for 2 days. And in the course of that meeting, this term collaboratory was invented. Mm-hmm. It turns out to be useful in funding and getting new funding to have new words.
Yeah.
And so it's, as you say, it's a play on the word of collaborate and laboratory. Mm-hmm. And at that meeting, it was defined simply as a laboratory without walls.
Right.
And so the primary initial work was funded largely by the NSF to explore acceleration and increase participation in science. The Collaboratory, among other things, has a democratization potential because people that don't have people who are not physically part of a major university, for example, can remotely participate. People who do not have access to multi-million-dollar computers or laboratories can collaborate and have access to those services. So then the National Academies of Science did a study of collaboratories and their potential, and there was a landmark report issued there. Then the NSF put out some major solicitations, and the University of Michigan was fortunate to actually get some of those large grants. And we worked on building a specific collaboratory with the space science community that studies the upper atmosphere, the magnetosphere, the phenomenon that causes the aurora borealis, the northern lights, but also occasionally knocks out multi-million-dollar satellites.
Right. Well, you know, that's so interesting because as you describe the early days, and I've heard you describe that and I've read about it some, I'm taken by how much I take for granted in collaboration with technology now that just didn't exist.
Yes.
And you were creating a new frontier. And I'm wondering, is it urban legend or was Steve Jobs involved in some of that early work or somewhere along the lines?
He was indirectly involved in at least two ways. First, the University of Michigan College of Engineering, where I had the privilege of serving as associate dean and then later dean. But the team of Jim Duderstadt, who went on to be president of University of Michigan, Chuck Vest, who went on to be the president of MIT, and myself had an opportunity when we were still in our 30s to try to transform the college into a more forward-looking place. And my job in particular was to do something about leading the transition from traditional mainframe computing to this new generation of personal and distributed computing. And just at that time, this was the early 80s, the early Lisa computers and later the Macintosh came out. And we became the major educational institution, the largest educational installation of Apple products at that time. And Steve Jobs, at least initially, had a huge interest in the educational impact of the personal computer. And he spent a lot of time at the University of Michigan, and we spent time there, so we got to know him personally. Then, as you know, there was a falling out between Steve Jobs and Apple, and he left and he went and created the Next Computing. And this was a revolutionary development too, because it was the first workstation-based computer that had what is technically known as an object-oriented building environment, and meaning that you have big modules of software that you can kind of move around and connect together, and you can build complex systems much more rapidly than you could in the past. And we adopted that technology to build the early collaboratories. That operating system is now what you know as the OS system of Apple after he went back. But the ease of use and so forth that you enjoy with the Apple products is a direct consequence of that object-oriented approach to systems that Steve Jobs pioneered with Next Computing.
It's interesting because it is new frontiers, and a lot of people think of him as developing new frontiers, and I was always fascinated to learn that connection between the University of Michigan, really seeking those new frontiers. And we've talked a little bit now about kind of the science behind it and how it was applied to the scientific and computing world. But how we really came together was this idea that the foundation has around how can we now apply the concept of the collaboratory that was kind of crafted and born out of the scientific data and computing world and begin to apply it to social change. Because as you know, in the time we've spent together, the Community Foundation really is creating this collaboratory to say, how do we bring data, people, ideas together in the same way that University of Michigan and others now have brought the scientific world together to create new innovative project ideas. How do you see now that you're realizing that this collaboratory concept is branching out, how do you see that playing out as time moves on?
Well, as you imply, the original focus on the scientific collaboratory is a generalizable idea, and the kind of biggest name for all that I sometimes use is distributed knowledge communities, by which I mean creating, using, disseminating, every aspect of knowledge. And it didn't take very long, for example, for the NSF to start looking at the science collaboratory in support of learning. And of course, a lot of the distributed learning, the concepts of MOOCs and all have come out of that work. The basic idea of the collaboratory is, and it goes by different names. There are places that have looked at collaboratories but call it connected learning environments and so forth. But the basic idea is to relax as many constraints as you can of time and distance to make it easier for people to engage with each other in creative and useful and meaningful use of technology. And so it relaxes constraints of geographical distance by allowing people to work together that are not physically together. It hopefully can accelerate time, the time to do something by reducing awkward travel and so forth. It also, in the scientific realm, we talk about it relaxing intellectual distance in the sense of making it easier for interdisciplinary teams to work together. Okay, and so I think in your context, the idea of people with diverse perspective and diverse interests can more readily come together and explore common ground. I want to mention, in the context of the next computer and the rapid prototyping that it allowed, that generally in creating a collaboratory which achieves some effective use, be it accelerating space science or building better community relations, getting the technology in place is the easy part.
Right.
The hard part is the adoption, the meaningful use of it, empowering people to use it, and getting people to think that we're not just doing things faster, better, cheaper that we've always done, but this technology can be so powerful that we can actually do some new things in new ways, which is the true definition of innovation. But to get there, you can't just sit down and write a spec. You've got to use a human-centered iterative design process where you have to try things out, let people experience them, make adjustments to improve it. But also, the process of trying it out often gives people more ideas about things they can do. So it's kind of a stair step. You build something that's useful, and then people's imagination about the next step, and you do that, and you do that, and you kind of iteratively develop this. So that's an important thing to remember as you try to apply the collaboratory concept. You've got to have people that are not only deploying the technology, you've got to have people that are assessing its impact and then informing the technologists of how it needs to be improved and iterated into the future.
Yeah. That whole idea of human-centered design is such at the heart of change making in the social sector. So I think it makes such a good fit, and it really, I think, has evolved into this initial partnership that we're celebrating today around having students from the University of Michigan, from the School of Information and the School of Social Work here in Southwest Florida, kind of bringing that human element, right? They're very skilled in a lot of different fields, but they're bringing that human design element to both the city of Fort Myers and then a project that FGCU is doing. How do you see that partnership with the students and this partnership with the University of Michigan adding value to what we're trying to do?
Well, the School of Information, which formed in the mid-90s, was a direct consequence of the experience of this interdisciplinary teams in building collaboratories and digital libraries. And increasingly obvious that we needed a new type of professional who not only knew the technology but also understood the social behavioral sides, as this technology just took over kind of every aspect of human endeavor. So these students and the whole mission of the School of Information is to produce people that will be effective in engaging in these complex socio-technical kinds of activities. And the School of Information was built on the culture of a library school. It was also heavily influenced by the social engagement agendas of major foundations like the Kellogg Foundation. And so most of our students have a strong societal improvement, societal engagement mission, and many of them go to make their life in the nonprofit or sector. So, there are three parts of learning. There's a learning about stuff and learning the theory. Then there is learning certain skills, and then there's learning to be an information practitioner. So it's very important that all our students engage in real world projects like those that we put together for this week. So I think there should hopefully be an ongoing synergy between providing the real world opportunities here the students having what we could call clinical experience, and hopefully your organization and the ones that are you partner with starting to appreciate the skill set of this new type of student that's coming out of the increasing number of information schools. It's also critical that we have the students' real-world projects and real application areas. And so having the students that are expert in health areas or others working with students that have a more generic knowledge of technology and how to use it is also extremely important.
Yeah. I was able to spend some time with some of the leadership of the city of Fort Myers yesterday, and they were reflecting just initially on the work that these graduate students were in town to do, and they said they just really saw such value that these students were solving real problems, right? Problems that they are facing day to day, and that the students were already identifying other projects that they could work on just based on what they were seeing while they were here. And I thought that that was very interesting from the city's perspective, because so many times, sometimes when you enter academia into a situation, people are hesitant about it because they think it's going to be blue sky. But the School of Information seems to really be preparing students for these real problems or real opportunities that municipalities, communities, organizations are facing. So how did this idea of really tackling problems that are immediate and real come to be?
Well, I think it's in the basic genes of the school, because we learn through the work on collaboratories that the hardest problems are actually in the social, behavioral, and the meaningful use. The raw power of the technology has been and continues to be ahead of our deep understanding of its meaningful use. And of course, like all technology, this technology can be used for good or evil. And so, I mean, although we have a PhD program which produces the next generation of faculty for information schools, and we now have an undergraduate program, the school primary focus has been on professional education. And professions and professional people have to have real world experience to call themselves a professional. So all of the students have some kind of a collaborative, entrepreneurial, often societally engaged kind of a project. It's just a core part of our curriculum, which has expanded. And one of the main problems of doing this is finding meaningful venues in which they can do this work, and finding places where the organization is really willing to take the risk of turning them loose on something useful, as opposed to having them clean out file drawers or sweep the floor. And one of the reasons that we were so excited about the Southwest Florida Community Foundation becoming involved is that you provide a liaison into these organizations, because it just becomes impractical for us. It's a relatively small school to directly manage all of these things, or even to find all of the places and organizations that with which we could benefit in collaborating.
And it really fits that model of a space without walls, a lab without walls, right? It doesn't have to happen in Michigan. I mean, that's what technology has allowed us to do. So I think that's interesting. And I was also fascinated to discover that some of the early funding came from the Kellogg Foundation. So I know historically the Kellogg Foundation is very interested in social change at a local and global level. Did that partnership influence this efforts around community change?
Well, the Kellogg Foundation has traditionally been very community involved, help people help themselves, empower the community. And an important part of community has historically been the public library. And as we had this digital tidal wave coming down the track, the leadership at the foundation began worrying about the public library somehow being swept away by the hubris of computer scientists. And I can say that because I am a computer scientist by training. And so they were looking for a place that would transform traditional book place-based libraries into something that could provide leadership for the digital age. Place that would preserve the core values of librarianship, particularly the public library tradition, but execute those values within the new digital realm. So there was a kind of a alignment of the planets where they were prepared to put money into this, and the university was looking independently at what we were going to do about transforming our library school, where other universities were closing them down. We made the opposite decision. And so that was the general rationale, but we quickly decided to simply call it the School of Information, and then you could add any other name you wanted after that, so that it had a very broad, the ambiguity of the name was intentional and intended to be kind of a license to do almost anything that involved information. The collaboratory work, as I said earlier, was largely the product of an interdisciplinary group that existed at least a whole decade before the opportunity to create the School of Information. But then that group of people were, by that time, convinced that there was a whole new interdisciplinary field afoot, and were increasingly frustrated by the ties back to their disciplinary departments, which were like computer science, psychology, law, economics, public policy, and so forth. And so they jumped at this opportunity to kind of do this friendly takeover of the library school. And so that then became the nexus for all this collaboratory work and so forth. And then that all later was reinforced by the digital library initiative and so forth.
Yeah. It's so fun for me to hear you describe the evolution of how this happened, because if I just see it as a timeline, I'm energized by the thought that our collaboratory is going to now be part of this timeline, like the evolution of how technology changes things, particularly in the social sector. So from my seat where I sit right now, I'm gazing out of a window and I'm seeing the construction of our collaboratory going on. So when I first met you, or learned I was going to meet you, I was a little nervous because I was going to be meeting a renowned computer scientist and engineer. But what I discovered about you quickly was you're a visionary, right? You're not locked into one discipline. And I think that's how this interdisciplinary concept really thrived under your leadership. So I'm going to ask you, as you sit here with me with our collaboratory in the background, what do you see happening here in 5 years, whether it's our partnership with the University of Michigan and the students? What is it that you hope when you and I meet back here in 5 years, our collaboratory is up and running, all kinds of students are coming in and out? What would you be pleased with? You know how this started from the beginning. What would you be pleased to see happening here in 5 years?
I'm going to sidestep your question a little bit by just making the observation that as you kind of get to know this history that I've been describing to you, hopefully you'll take away from it that we didn't sit down and plan on a PERT chart what we were going to do for the next 15 years. We just started doing stuff.
Yeah, it just evolved, it happened.
And then you have to think strategically, act opportunistically, and be true to your core values and make decisions in that. And some things are going to be failures and some are not. I mean, for example, the Express project that I mentioned, the remote preparation and review of proposals, was ultimately canceled by NSF because some lawyer said, oh, you're using research money for something that NSF might actually procure and use, and that's illegal. So, as you can imagine, I was very, very upset and disappointed by that. But then a month later, I was invited to this collaboratory workshop, and the rest was history.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So so I don't know exactly what the outcome is going to be. I just think that what I'm seeing in the leadership of the foundation, you and others, what I'm seeing in the physical investments next door, what I'm seeing from the meeting we had in Ann Arbor where you had representatives of the community and the other, I think the conditions are there for a similar story.
Yeah.
To let's take a great team and let's try to climb to the top of Mount Everest together.
Yeah.
And we're willing to tie our ropes tightly to look after each other's safety, to not grumble when it's our turn to cook the dish, cook and clean up.
Right.
Okay. So that's the most important thing I sense here is something kind of analogous to the conditions that I sensed that led me to take the risk of leaving a tenured faculty position in engineering and leading a whole new school.
Right. Because
Okay.
it's part of risk taking.
Yeah, it's so I think taking the risk, assembling a good team that trust each other, that and also you need to, and I know you know this, you need to, in working with your partners, you need to create the conditions of mutual self-interest. And that's certainly the thing you have to do in academia, because you don't control or boss or dictate to others. You have to create the conditions where people working together, bringing different talents, and with different goals in mind, they find an alignment where everyone benefits, although perhaps in somewhat different ways.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, one of your problems will be deciding what to actually do and do well, and what to do and what not to do. And it's important as you go forth in building this collaboratory that you are quite methodical about assessing it along the way, both to make iterative refinements and improvements as you go along, but also to actually be able to quantify what you have accomplished. Okay, so I don't know the exact answer to that question, but I know I have a very strong faith that if we come back in a year or 2 years or certainly 5 years, that some things will be much better in this community, and it'll be traceable, at least anecdotally, to things that have occurred here.
I can't think of anybody I'd rather take a journey with than you, and I want to thank you for
Well,
your
thank you.
willingness to partner with me.
Two more warnings.
Okay.
Be careful about managing expectations. It's often a good strategy to know you can do something before you claim you can. And the other is to keep in mind the possibility that you're actually maybe affecting the community foundation world at large. And try to find some fellow travelers in the community foundation world and do some convening. Like we did the same in trying to find some other universities that wanted to take a similar trip with us, and try to learn from each other, and form at least some ad hoc, loosely knit community of visionary community foundations.
Yeah, people to walk the
The
journey.
the meta community foundation.
People to go along with me.
Yeah, right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I appreciate it.
It's an honor to be here.
All
Thank
right,
you.
here we go.